having a conversation with civil rights attorney Natalie Jackson, who is an attorney for Trayvon Martin's parents. Natalie, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Hal.
And you are here to talk about Rest in Power, and you are a major player in this story because you fought to get this story out there, not for it to be swept under the rug, and you pushed for George Zimmerman's arrest.
Yes, and I think that along with the whole team, and I call it Team Ben Crump. So, yeah, we did. We fought for that just so that there would be a fair trial. And I think that that's the important thing to remember about this case. The protests were about the arrest of George Zimmerman, and they died down after he was arrested.
Well, let's talk about the trial. Was it a fair trial?
It was fair in the sense that it was a trial that the American justice system has deemed fair.
Well, it's so interesting because we're going back into it. We're looking at it with the perspective of time.
Yes.
There's more time on television than you usually see. And people raise a lot of points about the case. The series asks, was the prosecution outclassed by the defense?
We can debate that, but really I think that you would have had the same outcome with the same juror in this jury system, even if you had super lawyers against super lawyers. So I think that this trial was an outcome of what the American justice system is about. And really it's about, and this is what it should not be about, but race plays such a huge part in the American justice system and outcomes of trials. And that's what we saw here in this case. I mean, I think in retrospect, we've seen the actions of George Zimmerman, and since the trial, we've seen who he is. It baffled me because I was like, this was a kid walking home with candy. He's doing nothing wrong. I don't understand how you can say what George Zimmerman did, getting out of his car, following a kid with a gun in the dark, was okay, but this jury thought it was okay.
I find it so interesting how race was treated at the trial. Was it a major issue? Was it not addressed? Was it addressed indirectly? How do you see race being an issue at the trial?
As an attorney, it's what I see every day in the court system. Race is not used in a trial if it indicts white people, but if it is an indictment of Black people, then it's used every day in trial. So when you had the judge exclude the use of racial profiling, the word racial profiling from the jury, yet and still the defense was allowed to do nothing but insinuate the scary Black man theory and the myth in America. But that's what we see every day. Because of the consciousness of America and the court system, these are not things that are overtly done. They're just ingrained in us that this is the way it plays out.
I think the series in the episode, The Fifth Hour, talks about Emmett Till, goes back to issues and about how it is ingrained.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I know Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon's mother, has always said. This case is kind of like an Emmett Till case, because here in Emmett Till, you had a Black boy who allegedly whistled at a white girl. And that was, that was judge, jury, and everything to him. So in this case, the beginning was the shooting of Trayvon, and the sheriff's office saying that this was Daniel Brown. Even when you have an indication that Trayvon lived there, it was dark, he was walking home, he had nothing, he was unarmed, and Zimmerman had a gun. So yet and still, we've given Zimmerman the benefit of the doubt from the arrest on. Yes, he deserved a fair trial. Yes, he deserved his day in court, and he deserved for the prosecution to have to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But in these type cases, you first have to see the victim as worthy of a fair trial. And in these type cases, many times when the victim is Black, that doesn't happen.
Well, that's an interesting point, too, in the series, in that through the trial, we didn't really come to know or understand Trayvon, that the state didn't do a good enough job of telling us who he was. How do you see that?
I remember a conversation that I had with Bernie Delaranda, who was the prosecutor, and Bernie is someone I respect. So I thought that he did the best job that he could, given what he believed about this case. Let's say that. So one of the questions that Bernie asked me, he said, what if Trayvon was the aggressor, or Trayvon punched George Zimmerman? I said, it would not matter to me, Bernie, because George Zimmerman followed him in the dark with a gun. I would expect him to defend himself. Now, here's the thing that has always baffled me about this case. When people say, well, Trayvon hit George, well, there's no evidence that there was ever a fight. When you look at the autopsy, if you really look at it, Trayvon never had, they didn't find any DNA of George Zimmerman under his nails, on his fingers. There were no marks that would come from any sort of aggressive fight on his hands. There was no injury to him. So I think just the fact that people assume there was a fight also is an indictment of how we think about race in the United States.
Through the trial, looking at it again, we see that Trayvon was quite a ways away from the sidewalk, and the sidewalk becomes like this weapon.
Right.
So Trayvon,
that was preposterous to me. I was insulted that there was obviously no weapon of Trayvon. So to say the sidewalk was the weapon and for the jury to buy it, at that point I knew the case was over.
Okay. Now the series raises this point. Was the prosecution trying? Was it trying to win this case?
I think they were trying. I think that what you have is you have a court system that has ingrained racism within it. Then each of us have grown up in a system in America where we have discrimination, where we have our views about different races. So I think when you have a case like this, I think the prosecution was trying with all the tools that they had. Do I think that this case would have benefited from a Black prosecutor? Yes, I do.
Now you're in this hour and you're talking about the dummy, the use of the dummy. I'm just, what you remember of that, it seems to be a serious misstep by the state.
Well, it was a misstep by the state, and it also was a subconscious indictment of how they saw Trayvon as being an aggressor. When people ask me, do I think they threw the case? No, I don't think they threw the case. I think they tried as hard as they could, given their abilities and their understanding of race in America and what they believe about race in America. If you see Trayvon as this young Black aggressive person, then yes, you're going to engage this dummy. But if you really look at the facts of the case, we have a timeline of this case that's very clear. And we have it because we have 911 calls. We have Trayvon's phone records of when his phone was engaged and when it was not engaged. So the timeline is clear. This whole interaction took less than 2 minutes between Trayvon and George Zimmerman. So if you look at that, then what type of fight really could there have been? What type of aggressive fight and that George Zimmerman, who had a gun, could have been so in fear of his life? I believe it was, and I say 2 minutes, but I would like to look back at my records. I don't know. I would encourage your listeners to look, but I believe it was 57 seconds.
The other thing, too, that's fascinating is when John Guy is on top of the dummy, then you're presenting Trayvon as the aggressor.
And there is no evidence of that. That is what I'm talking about. There was never any evidence that Trayvon, other than George Zimmerman saying so, that Trayvon was the aggressor. Once again, the autopsy, Trayvon had none of George Zimmerman's DNA under his nails. If there were a fight, you would assume that there would be some scratching or some transfer of DNA. There was no marks or swelling on his hands that would come from punching someone in the face or any of those things. There was no blood on Trayvon's hands. And we saw from George Zimmerman, he was bleeding profusely. There was no blood on his hands. So everything that people believed came from George Zimmerman, even subconsciously, what we believed. When we look at George Zimmerman and we see blood and he tells us that he was hit, we believed him.
Well, now the dummy also serves as an opening for the defense. And you see Mark O'Mara get on top of that dummy. I'm wondering, how do you think the defense did in this case?
I think the defense won a case that was very winnable for them. To my disappointment, it was a case that was winnable for them if they chose to take the high road and not use race, but they didn't choose to do that. They actually used race. One of their final witnesses was a lady whose home was robbed by 3 Black boys.
And she is in this hour.
Weeks before. And I was like, okay, no objection to that? What is the relevance to this? Trayvon didn't rob her. Are you saying that young Black men are a threat? One of the other things that to me was very offensive was the Black cutout. there was a cutout that the defense used of Trayvon. It was a silhouette cutout of Trayvon. And in that cutout, of course, you have the stand and you have he had on this hoodie. Trayvon weighed 150 something pounds. I can't remember the exact, but it was 150 something pounds, and he was 5'10". In this hoodie, he looked big and looming, the silhouette cutout, and it was a black silhouette cutout of a big looming figure. So there were many times I felt the defense used race, and they used it subtly to trigger this white jury to think of Trayvon as a menace. And to me, that is what we as Black lawyers and as Black activists have fought against in our jury system. And it's something that I think for many white people, they don't understand how hard that is to fight against when you're trying jury cases for victims or for defendants. There's the old saying about pornography. I know it when I see it. Most Black people know when race is being insinuated or a stereotype is being insinuated into a case. And I felt this happened over and over by the defense.
Do you think there is any way that the state could have won? Or are things just so ingrained?
No, I think that they could have won if they were willing to talk about racial profiling, if they were willing to talk about the calls that George Zimmerman made on Black men. I think that, and not even willing, I don't know if they're capable of doing that, because I think that unless you deal with this on a day-to-day basis, you may not have the skill set. There are white people that do have the skill set to talk about race in an in-depth way, but most people, it's just not on their radar because it doesn't really affect them. It's just like anything, there are politicians who deal with politics every day, so of course they know all about politics in and out. When they're talking to me, a lay person, I'm like, oh, okay, but it doesn't affect me. And that's what happened. So I do think that with these prosecutors, I don't know if they realize how important of a case this was to the Black community. And I think if there were a Black prosecutor that prosecuted it, and I do a podcast on Law and Crime, the television show, and there's a case in Tennessee that's going on right now where a white officer shot a Black boy, and the Black prosecutor, Black state attorney there, and he was just convicted, which is you rarely see. But I do think that it does matter if the person prosecuting the case understands the intricacies of the racial dynamics of the case.
Did the system fail Trayvon's parents, do you think?
Yes. Yes, I think that the system failed Trayvon's parents, and I think the system has failed many Black victims, from the police brutality cases that we see to others. So, yeah, I do think the system failed, and I think that it will continue to fail unless we address societal issues of racism. So it's the system, but it's also the way that people, because the system is just a system without its operators.
Now, your mother is also in this series.
Yes.
And your mother, tell us about your mother.
My mother, she is an activist in Sanford, and she also runs the Sanford Goldsboro Historic Society, where they run the Goldsboro Museum and the Historic Goldsboro Welcome Center.
And her name?
Her name is Frances Oliver.
And she is very effective in this hour. At the end, she talks about the disappointment with the verdict.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what do you see as the main response to the verdict?
I think it was heartbreak, honestly, among the Black community. I remember us debating about the jury. And I thought to myself, when I saw the jury, I said, okay, this is a majority white woman jury. There was one Hispanic woman, but it was a female jury. And I thought, okay, this could go two ways. I was like, they could see that this is a child and they can feel some empathy and think about it from there. Or they could see it could just be well, he's not my child, an othering of Trayvon. And I don't know if that happened or not, but I was optimistic in saying, and I remember having a conversation with Ben Crump. I said, it's probably good that we do have a white jury, because now we can gauge how far we've kind of come on these issues. That's what I was thinking. And so I think that for many people, it was really heartbreaking. But I also think that many people thought that perhaps the prosecution could have done a better job. So not just blaming the jury on this. I've talked to people, and this is personally how I felt. You didn't have to do a great job on this case to come back with a guilty verdict. I thought the evidence was there. You had 5 statements, contradictory statements from George Zimmerman. I thought George Zimmerman's own words were the star witness in the case.
But how far we've come, I'm wondering, how far have we come?
We go around the country talking to young people about this case. What you see now, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of this, it was a wake up from the Trayvon Martin case. So when we talk about how far we've come, I think that there's a realization that we've actually been sticking our head in the sand and nobody has been doing anything. So I think the Trayvon Martin case has woken up young people. And there's a fire in young people who have white friends who've grown up in white neighborhoods, and they have all of this where they really want equality. They love their friends, but they're demanding that their friends become allies in equality. And I think that's what we're seeing. So I think that when you say how far we've come, I actually am inspired by what I see around the country with the willingness to talk about race issues among white and Black young people.
In the series, Sabrina Fulton said that they didn't want the verdict to define who Trayvon Martin was. And I think they've used the series to explain who he was. Right. What do you hope people take away from the series?
Well, I want to tell you a story about that. I remember while we were waiting for the verdict, and I remember that after the last witness, after closing arguments, juries, Sabrina and Tracy went home. A lot of people don't know that, but that's why you don't see them at the press conference afterwards. They went home. Sabrina left, and I remember her exact words. Her exact words was, "I don't care what this verdict is. They will not define Trayvon. I will define Trayvon." And that was so powerful to me. And I remind her of that all the time when I see her. I was like, can I just tell you how inspirational that was? And to see the work that you have done with the Trayvon Martin Foundation, and to see the things that you have done and the support that you've given mothers all over the country, the scholarships that you've given, the racial awareness. One thing that I think is important for your listeners to know is that Sabrina Fulton, she's a college graduate. Her father was a police officer. She's solidly middle class, and her family is very racially diverse. So for her, she never wanted this to be a race issue the way that it kind of turned out to be. Her big saying, her big quote was, "This isn't a Black thing, it's not a white thing, this is a right or wrong thing." And that was always her big quote about it. So I think that she has just gone about trying to change the conversation, not only about Trayvon, because of course she's done that, but just the conversation about guns in America and how we see race relations in America. I think that she's done a phenomenal job. She's really my hero.
Is there anything I'm not asking you, any point that you want to make?
One of the things I think was kind of glossed over, and we've kind of talked about it, is just the youth movement that came out of this, out of the Trayvon Martin case and the youth movement. I think that enough cannot be said about the start of the Black Lives Matter movement and how Trayvon really started that and how young people were waking up. Because what you saw with young people and young Black people, and especially young middle-class Black people, because that's who it spoke to. That's who this case spoke to, because they saw Trayvon as like them. When you have President Obama coming out and saying, Trayvon could have been my son, that was the impetus to me as I talked to these young people around the country. I talked to them at Harvard, at the best institutions in the nation. And they tell me that they became active during the Trayvon case. That's when they first became active in wanting to change the world and change racial relationships in the world.
What is it about this particular case that touched so many people, do you think?
I think it was the first images that came out about Trayvon. If you remember it, here in Orlando, more people remember it, but there was such a divide over the pictures. Was he being portrayed as a young kid? Were these pictures just, were they photoshopped? No, they weren't. Trayvon did not fit into any of our stereotypical, how we see young Black thugs, what certain elements of society wanted him to be, so that they could not like him and they could hate him. The pictures that were first put in out in the public of Trayvon were of him skiing with his mother, on horseback riding, the Hollister shirt, the famous Hollister shirt picture. Those were not the pictures that you normally see of young Black kids who are killed and, and who societal forces want to demonize as thugs. And for the young Black middle class kids, they saw themselves in that picture. And they have been raised in a world where we're all equal. They've been raised in these bubbles where they grow up with their white friends, they live in white neighborhoods, but then they see this, and then they see the divide, and how some of their friends were like, "Well, what was Trayvon doing? Why was he?" And they're like, "What? You would not believe how many kids had asked me," and they would look at me baffled and say, "Trayvon wasn't doing anything." And so to them, that is scary, that they can be portrayed like that when they haven't been doing anything wrong. So I think that is really what you see. And because you have an awakening of middle-class Black people and Black youth, these are youth that have money. They have education. They have the skills to combat this. This is what you're seeing when you see Andrew Gillum run for governor. This is what you're seeing when you see Aramis Ayala run for state attorney. And this is what you're going to see in society. It's going to continue.
I really appreciate you coming in to talk to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Orlando Sentinel Conversations. Jeff and Hal will be back next Monday to discuss the final hour of Rest in Power, the Trayvon Martin story. In the meantime,